Hello, fellow grave crawlers, and welcome to part 3 of Reconstruction, America after the Civil War. Part 3 picks up as the South, now with Reconstruction at its end, begins to make its comeback. One of the first things the South does is create the Jim Crow laws, which enforce racial segregation in all public facilities and transportation. And when I say public facilities, I'm also talking about the entire public system that was established in Part 2. So that's schools, hospitals, all of that. The motto of Jim Crow laws states separate but equal. But public facilities for African Americans are always vastly inferior to the facilities for white Americans, if there are even facilities for the African Americans at all. And when it comes to transportation, seating is always in the back of the bus, or in the most raggedy car on the train, or in the worst places to stand while riding a ferry. Next, the South decides to bring slavery back, but with a brand new face. As a dark mirror to 40 Acres and a Mule, sharecropping emerged in the late 1860s, but didn't become prevalent until 1880. Sharecropping allowed African Americans access to plots of land that ranged from 30 to 50 acres. The idea was that the African Americans would live on the land and farm it. However, the African American did not own the land. They rented it, and they paid their rent by giving over a share of their crop to the landowner. Now, even though African Americans couldn't own this property, it still would have been good if it wasn't for the fact that most sharecroppers didn't have their own equipment, animals, and seeds to farm with. So they had to rent these items from the landowners as well. And that's where the whammy was. Interest charges for renting these items could quickly overwhelm the sharecropper and leave them in eternal debt to the landowner, effectively making them a slave to that landowner. But that wasn't the most lucrative form of slave labor. That came from convict leasing. Since the police and prison system in the South was set up to protect white Southerners from the Negro savages, the majority of Southern prison inmates were African American. And the prisons did not discriminate based on gender or age. There were African American men, women, and children in prison. Convict leasing let the prisons hire out their prisoners to white Southern planters, or even corporations, who would purchase the labor through bids. And of course, it wasn't the prisoners who got paid for their labor. It was the prisons who collected, and they were the ones who got fat off the income. Next, it was time to suppress African Americans having any further say in what happened in the U.S. and having any true political power. So the South created voter suppression tactics that forced would-be voters to take literacy tests, pay poll taxes, and prove that they understood the state constitution before they would be qualified and allowed to vote. And if one wasn't qualified to vote, one couldn't serve on a jury or run for local offices. This disenfranchisement destroyed not just the Southern African American vote, but also the vote of poor white Southerners. And as a result, voter rolls dropped in the Southern states, allowing the Republican Party to be pushed out of the South and the pro-racist Democrats to establish a one-party control. This led many African Americans in the South, dubbed exodusters, to migrate west to northern rural Kansas in order to get away from the oppression. But there was more darkness on the horizon. In 1883, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the landmark Civil Rights Bill of 1885, stating that it was unconstitutional. The Supreme Court went on to say that the 14th Amendment did not prevent people from denying individuals access to all of the things spoken about in the Civil Rights Bill, and that those things were all privately owned, and it was the owner's right to make the decision to give service or not. Thus, segregation spread out of the South and into the rest of the United States. And this is where Part 3 leaves us at. Part 4 picks up in the 1890s, as Edward A. Pollard's book, The Lost Cause, takes on a new life as the ideological justification for white supremacy. It leads to the formation of a group called the Daughters of the Confederacy in 1894, which takes control of all Civil War memory. Wishing to honor the men and women of the Confederacy generation, the Daughters of the Confederacy sought to write a new narrative that lifted the Confederacy up from defeat. They wanted to regulate how the story of the Civil War will be taught in schools, and wanted those stories to tell their version of the truth. This meant a pro-Southern, pro-Confederate history. So, reject any book or thing that said that the South fought to hold its slaves. Reject any book or thing that said that slave owners were cruel and unjust to their slaves. Reject any book or thing that painted the Confederacy and their cause in a negative image. And also, most importantly, reject the true story of slavery in the South. African American slaves would now be prosperous, happy, and joyful, because they had the whole world provided to them by their white masters. So if you ever wondered where those pictures of plantations with happy slaves come from, or the stories, now you know. White Southern children, who were none the wiser, took in this changed history as fact. And it will be they who will grow up to become the segregationists and racists of the 1950s and 60s, which would lead to the most known civil rights movement by African Americans. By the early 1900s, African Americans had virtually no political power. And in 1912, when Woodrow Wilson was elected president, he spread segregation into federal employment, which further locked African Americans out. In winter of 1915, President Wilson hosted a screening of the film, The Birth of a Nation, at the White House. The 3-hour film fictionalized the history of the Civil War and Reconstruction, and was part of the whole Lost Cause propaganda machine. It changed the Ku Klux Klan from terrorists into heroic vigilantes, protecting the country from the perils of racial equality. It reinforced the stereotype that African American men were barbaric rapists, out to violate every white woman they could get their hands on, and that it was every white man's responsibility and duty to keep their white women safe. It also nurtured the idea that during Reconstruction, African Americans were too lazy and ignorant to fully master the citizenship that they were offered during that time. It even claimed to show a reenaction of an actual situation that occurred in 1870 at the State House of Representatives in South Carolina, which, if you remember, was considered the seat of African American political power during that time. It showed African American legislators putting their feet up on desks, eating fried chicken, and swigging liquor out of flasks, while the dialogue painted them as ignorant, buffoonish characters who didn't know up from down or right from left. Unfortunately, many whites in both the South and North showed just how intelligent they really were by buying into the propaganda and taking the film as actual historical fact of what had happened during the American Civil War and Reconstruction. It spawned the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan, and the use of a burning cross as part of their iconography. And it solidified the belief that African Americans were inferior, zero-class citizens who'd gotten too big for their britches and had bitten the hand that had fed them. As a result, many white Americans turned against African Americans, which would set the stage for the struggles that African Americans would endure in the 1900s and lead into the civil rights movement of the mid-1900s, led by figures such as Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. And this is where part 4 ends. So how about that? How many of you didn't know any of this? As an African American, it was a trip to find out that there was a time when African Americans had it going on like this. Political power, true equal opportunity, it seems like a fairy tale. And it's a shame to know that it was all ruined just because you had white people who thought that just because they were white, they were automatically superior to every other race. And that it was their right and privilege to perpetuate a system that still stands today, where they and they alone hold absolute power and control over everything. It may be futile, but I still hold on to the hope that one day we will have a world with true equality, where race and gender are no longer factors. I mean, we nearly had it before. But although I hold on to that hope, I do not hold my breath. So thank you all for watching, and I hope this was informative and not too dry and boring. I'm Paper Zombie, and I'll catch you next time.